It's on the bottom. You'll see next to share screen.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's recording.
To the cloud, right?
I wrote to the cloud.
Good. All right, excellent. So you're all set, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay,
So
perfect.
have a great class. I'm gonna
Thank you.
go on to my next meeting.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay,
If I
Chag
don't
Kosher
see you
V'Sameach.
again- You too. Hi there. We're just waiting. Well, it's only 7:13. So just waiting for more folks to sign in. How are you, Mrs. Moed? All good? I'm just waiting a couple minutes. Thank you all for being early. My father, alav hashalom, would always say for him, being on time meant coming early. So it is according to my iPhone, it's 7:14. So I'm going to wait. And and then as soon as we get started, if you folks want to put your video on, that would be nice. If you're not, if you want to keep it on video, that's fine too. At some point though, what I will try to do closer to our endpoint is stop and I'll unmute in case anybody has some questions or comments or something to share. It's obviously easier if people are on the video because then I can see if somebody's raising their hand or nodding, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just going to wait a few minutes. I'll wait one more minute and then we will get started. All right, well, it is 7:16 and I'm going to begin. So thank you, all of you who have joined us tonight. And it is really hard to believe that before we turn around, Pesach is actually going to be here. We might be in a state of denial, but it's essentially, tonight is Wednesday night. So it's in about a week and a few days, but why do I have to rub it in? All right. So I hope that many of you have already begun to start thinking about your Seders, if you are hosting, if you're soloing, if you'll be able to be at the Jewish Center, if you'll be able to be with family, with some friends, whoever's your pod, and that please God, it should be a safe and healthy, but also meaningful. When I hear people talk about, oh, Seder, it's so boring. It's something that I have to actually say I can't relate to. I try to be empathetic about it. And that's what I want to try to help us overcome tonight, because if a Seder is boring, then it really then requires everybody to take a step back and say, well, what can we do to make it more lively, make it more meaningful? And the truth is that the text itself is so interesting and so exciting that I think even just if we didn't add anything else, there's so much of what we have of the 15 steps of the Seder that we should never have that feeling of being bored. So I hope, Bezrat Hashem, as we continue tonight, to give you what I really wanted to try to do tonight was not really do a text-based class, but rather go through different things about the Seder, different ideas, different things that the rabbis dealt with, that the commentators over the year dealt with. And hopefully that can help all of us have a more meaningful and please God, not in any way a boring Seder. So what I wanted to start with, and maybe one or two of you are in my Tuesday morning shiur, so I apologize if some of this is a little repetitive, but I wanted to kind of move to discuss something that really happens before we even get to the Seder, and that's the period of time we're in. And that is getting ready for Pesach. And getting ready for Pesach, if I were to throw it out, I think to most of you, you probably would say, well, what does it mean to get ready for Pesach? What is like, if this was David Letterman, right? The 10 top answers of what does it mean to get ready for Pesach. I think probably number one answer is to make sure that our house, in particular our kitchen, is Pesachdik, that we've gotten rid of all the chametz. But what we see from the rabbis is that there is a more spiritual endeavor that we have to be involved with, that it's not only about getting rid of physical chametz, it's also about getting rid of spiritual chametz. The first part, though, that I want to deal with is the eradication of the physical chametz, which I'm very fond of quoting Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg, the rabbi of the Boca Raton Synagogue, who has said that when we clean for Pesach, he said, we're not doing spring cleaning. He said, unless he said, like we've been eating our sandwiches in the closets, and I'm not talking about crumbs that potentially could be in coats or jackets or in a knapsack, etc. But unless we have been eating in a closet, we don't have to dedicate a rainy Sunday to going through every single closet. If you want to do that, what is her name? Maria Konda, sort of the cluttering, the anti-cluttering queen, right? Go ahead, you're welcome to do it, but that's not Pesach cleaning. What is the essence of preparing for Pesach? It's the eradication of chametz. So you have to figure out wherever you've eaten, wherever children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews, wherever you've been, that's where you want to get rid of chametz. And of course, that main location would obviously be places like a kitchen, a dining room, a living room. We know all of that. But I've always been taken with this idea that of what I call holy housework. And I came to that sort of coining that term because of something that I had read that Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichever, who was very well known as a Hasidic Rebbe, the 17th, 18th century. And he sought sort of justice. He spoke to God to complain, why are you not treating your people better? He was very much into being sort of like that Melitz Yosha for us with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. But he once wrote something that really inspired me, and which was the following: when Pesach was coming, he would go out and watch all the Jewish women toiling, scrubbing, rinsing, and chasing after every crumb of chametz. And I hope today this is one area that I hope is more egalitarian, that the men are also involved. And I know many men who are helping their wives and etc. Or certainly having to do it in their own home if they're soloing. But he said that every Pesach he would go out before Pesach and watch the Jewish women toiling, scrubbing, rinsing, and chasing after every crumb of chametz. And what he would do is that he would lift up his eyes to Shamayim, to heaven, and mimicking what we say as a kavana, as a spiritual moment of intention on Rosh Hashanah, where we ask that the angels, according to this spiritual kavana, that are born of the shofar sounds of Tekiah, Shivarim, Teruah, and Tekiah, should speak on our behalf, right, to God in Shamayim. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak would say, Master of the world, may it be your will that the angels born of toiling, scrubbing, rinsing, and tidying come before your throne of glory and speak on our behalf. Now, this actually works better when you compare the Hebrew abbreviations for Tekiah, right? Tekiah, Shivarim, Teruah, and Tekiah, Tashrik. It works better when we then understand why he was saying this, because if we take a look at the Yiddish abbreviation for those sounds of the shofar, what do we come up with? The exact same acronym of Kratzen, Shobin, Ribin, and Kashavin. So what he has done is in the seemingly mundane task of cleaning, he has said that holiness resides. That's a very profound idea because truthfully, Baruch Hashem, I have to say that thank God every year, up until last year of my married life, we've been able to get scholar in residence opportunities. So the last year was the first time I ever had to fully prepare my house for Pesach from before I was married. The last time was when I was still living home with my parents, because even when I was living out of the house, I still went to them. I sold my chametz, etc. It's the same with our apartment. We sold it, but we went away. I didn't have to turn over our whole house, and particularly the kitchen. So I thought about that last year, and please God, I'm thinking about that this year as I'm like trying to clean up the kitchen and the oven and all those little crevices. These words of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev reminds me that they're actually, even in this seemingly mundane task, there is a level of holiness there. Why? Because we're doing it l'shem shamayim. And I wanted to share that with everyone, because we can just get caught up in becoming very obsessive about the cleaning and just not see it and feel it's just mere drudgery. It isn't. We're doing it for a very important purpose. And that extends also, which is very interesting, to the next step. Before we even get to the Seder, we do b'dikat chametz and biur chametz, right? We search for the chametz. We put 10 pieces of bread out. If you go into some of this, into the kosher stores, or if you look even online, you can order now. It used to be some of the Jewish organizations would send out a kit. I think some of us are familiar with, of a feather, of a spoon, and sometimes they would even give a candle. Now some of them even give you the 10 pieces of bread. So it's like foolproof. Why do we get 10 pieces of bread? Some say it's based on like the influence of the Kabbalistic idea of 10 sfirot, right? The emanations of God. And so we put the 10 pieces around. But the Belzer Rebbe, blessed memory, asked the following question. He said, I understand, he said that after we're done, right, with b'dikat chametz the next day, which this year would be Friday morning, we have to burn the chametz this year Friday morning, obviously, even though normally we burn it on the Erev Yom Tov, but we could not burn it Shabbat morning, right? That would be a violation of Shabbat. So we burn it Friday morning, but we don't annul the chametz, actually, the phrase, until Shabbat morning. And you should check with Rabbi Levine for all the different procedures, which is very a little more complicated. So the Belzer Rebbe, though, asked this question. He said, when we come to the part of biur chametz, the burning of the chametz, he said, where we burn it's a wooden spoon. So the Masorah is that you burn the spoon and you burn the feather. He said, but why do we burn the candle? It seems wasteful. Why would we burn it? Because one would think, just use it again. So he says, no, there's a deeper reason why we have to burn that candle. And he says that when we take a look at chametz, and this is the part of what does chametz spiritually represent, many commentators say it represents, because chametz is leaven, and what is our bread, right? The bread is puffed up. Matzah is flat, but chametz, anything with yeast and leaven, it's puffed up. So he says that chametz really represents, he says, like chisaron and pagam. He says it represents what is lacking, the flaws, the negative, sort of the yetzer hara, right? And rabbis discuss, it's very interesting, like we didn't have a yetzer hara, we would never get married, we would never build a house, we wouldn't get a job, because we need drive. But how do you channel that? So he says that when we use this candle, he says it becomes the vehicle to actually search out the negative, because if we see chametz as somewhat as what is representing what is lacking and the flaws, he says we have looked in every crack and crevice for it. He said, but the reason he said that we burn the candle is, he said, we want to eradicate the negative source and our negative attitude and mindsets from our midst, and instead the next lights that we use have to look for the good things in life. It's very important, obviously, it's a practical matter to use the candle. It's interesting that we don't use a torch, we only use a candle. And it's part of this, I think, idea that we're looking specifically very in every single crevice. But he says, it reminds us that chametz then is not just only about that leavened bread, it's about that negativity within us. And I think, and I include myself, sometimes it becomes very easy to kind of criticize other people for they don't do this or they're that, or we see negative, but he's reminding us that the light we shine on others and the light we shine on ourselves has to be for a positive force. In fact, what's interesting is that a number of years ago, I remember pre-coronas, there was a group that had an event in Times Square on the eve of the secular New Year, a New Year's Eve, in which they set up this big bonfire and they told everybody, bring pieces of paper and throw in there whatever was bad from the last year of your behavior or bad things that happened. And it should just go poof as we go into the New Year. So some people I've read had suggested that even Havdol, on when we do Biur Chametz, you could write down certain negative things and throw it in. My sense is let's have it in our mind to say that Bezrat Hashem, when Pesach is over, and if the redemption has not yet come and we resume our lives, there's nothing like that stampede. If you've ever been on a Pesach program, right after the last day of when Pesach ends, it's like we haven't eaten, but there's pizza in the dining room, quick run, right? It's an amazing stampede. So I always say that's okay. That kind of chametz, it's okay to reabsorb into our lives. But the spiritual chametz that we got rid of, let's not bring that back. Let's get rid of it. So then I think what this does is it reminds us then that Pesach then almost becomes this idea of eradicating spiritual chametz. It becomes like another mini Yom Kippur. In other words, we have to look inside ourselves and say, what is it that we kind of want to do over and do better for the coming years? So that's, I think, something to, before we even get to the table, like our work kind of begins. And it's not just only about cleaning our homes, but it's about cleaning ourselves. In fact, there's a linguistic understanding that what does the word Mitzrayim mean when we say we should be liberated from Mitzrayim? And we, of course, at the Seder say, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam l'rot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim, that everybody is required to see themselves as though they left Mitzrayim. So some of the rabbis point to the fact that the word Mitzrayim also has a connection to the concept of narrow straits, and that we have to kind of break out of the narrowest, the spiritual narrowness, what we might call spiritual angioplasty. We should never, ever need the real thing, but rather it's like a clearing. It's like putting that balloon in and clearing out any of those arteries that need cleansing. So that there's kind of spiritual work to be done before we even get to the Seder. And when we get to the Seder, there are 15 steps. And what I want to try to share with you are certain things that you can perhaps add to your Seder. And I want to try to show some of the sources for that. So one of the, there are two interesting things that we have at our Seder, in addition to the Seder plate, right? So one of the things that is on the Seder plate, we'll see in a minute, is of course the shank bone, which we don't eat. And every year I get phone calls, people who are panicked, who said, I just found out, I'm Ashkenazic, I should not be having roasted meat at my Seder. So I said, look, if you braise it, put water in, you put some type of liquid, it's okay. Sephardim they have the reverse custom that many Sephardim actually will eat some form of lamb. I've always said in my next life, I want to come back Sephardic because I love their salatim and I want to be able to eat lamb chops at my Seder. But what's interesting is that we don't eat, when we think about it, we don't eat at our Seder, we don't eat the shank bone. That's something, because that represents the Korban Pesach. But all the other things on the Seder plate, whether it's the charoset, whether it's the maror, and of course the matzah and the egg, those things we do eat. And we'll come to an interesting question of why do we have those things on the Seder table? And it really points to an interesting challenge that the rabbis faced once the Beis Hamikdash was no longer standing in Jerusalem. Imagine what was that first Pesach like after the year 70, after Tisha B'Av in the year 70. What was it like to be in Yerushalayim or anywhere in Eretz Yisrael, and you don't have a Beis Hamikdash to come to offer the Karban Pesach? So it's such a trauma. And the rabbis were so brilliant about this because what they realized was an educational endeavor was needed. In a sense, what are you going to do with Pesach if the main focus of it, right? We read in the Torah that Hashem says to us, we have to bring the Karban Pesach. We have to mark there, it says, mark our doors with the blood, right, of it. We have to eat the part of it with the bitter herbs. And of course, we have to eat matzah. And then we have to tell the story to our children. And we'll see in a minute what happens like this year if you're soloing, you don't have children, whether it's children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews, to ask those 4 questions and to ask these things. What do you do? So we'll come to that in a minute. But that first year, what could it be like? So there's 2 things that we discover that's very interesting. And that is that the way the rabbi said, look, we have to take what we have been doing of having this covenantal meal, right? A consecrated, what I would call, if I spoke about holy housework, I'm going to talk about holy eating, because that's what it was. In other words, that you would sit down, and what we learn from what we see in the Mishnah and elsewhere, okay, is that the order of what they devised as a Seder was actually the reverse of what we have, right? Because we have this year, we have in our Haggadah, we have 4 questions, and everybody says there's actually a 5th question. What's the 5th question? I think you all know what that 5th question is. When do we eat, right? So the way it was originally settled is that people that they had the meal. In other words, they had all the steps, because after all, when we take a look at Manishtana, it doesn't sort of make sense that a child or a youngest person or even an adult is asking questions about things that happened at a Seder when they haven't happened yet, right? They're asking why on all of their nights we eat leavened bread and unleavened bread, but tonight we only eat matzah, but we haven't eaten matzah yet. Think about it. At a normal meal, we make kiddush and then we wash. At the Seder, we only wash, right, later on. Okay, so what's very interesting is that things were reversed. When our sort of, the Haggadah was developed. The Haggadah is really first Haggadah was developed around the 8th or 9th century during the Gaonic period, and was based on sources that we find in the Gemara, and we'll come to a minute about that the rabbis introduced the idea of having 4 cups. And why wine? Why do we have wine? And they said because wine represents royalty. It represents the whole idea of liberation. It represents a celebration. To have a true celebration, we need wine. I think what I should have done is had one of the liquor stores deliver a small bottle of wine to all of us. We could all make a l'chaim, right? But in the Mishnah in Pesachim, what does it say? Right? It says that that they bring food, right? And then he dips with lettuce until he reaches the main course, in which the matzah is going to be eaten. Then they bring the matzah, the lettuce, the charoset, and 2 dishes, right? And it says, and in the time of the temple, they used to bring the Karban Pesach. They pour a 2nd cup of wine, and then it says, this is where we get a form of the 4 questions. It says, and here the son questions his father, what has changed this night from all other nights? Then all other nights we eat both chametz and matzah. On this night we eat only matzah. That on all other nights we eat other vegetables. On this night we eat bitter herbs. On all other nights we eat meat that is roasted, stewed, or boiled. On this night we eat only roasted meat. And on all other nights we dip vegetables once. On this night we dip twice. And it says, and according to the son's understanding, his father teaches him, and we can add it, make it gender neutral, and teaches all the children. So what you see then is the meal came first, and then the child sees the dipping and sees the maror and sees the matzah and says, I don't understand it. Now, why was it flipped? was flipped for a very practical reason. It's something that I remember when my children were little, I used to beg them. I say, take a nap, because we don't want you falling asleep at the Seder. Even adults, you've worked so hard to come to the Seder. And like now with daylight savings time, it's late, right? So they said, we don't want the children falling asleep, that if they have to sit through an entire meal, they're never going to get to the Manishtana. So it's very interesting. The Manishtana comes very early in the Seder. It's also interesting, if you notice, what question is missing from the Mishnah. We see that also in other sources when we look for example, in the Gemara. We don't have today a question regarding, on all other nights we eat meat that's stewed or boiled or roasted. Tonight we only eat roasted meat. What question eventually replaced that was the question about reclining. And the question is asked, why, what happened? So it's very interesting, because that goes to the very heart of what I said, of what was it like to have a Passover meal and to try to follow what is the Masorah from the Torah if you can't bring the Korban Pesach. And we see this, it's very interesting that a figure no less than Rabban Gamliel and others leading people actually attempted to eat almost like a sacrifice that, like, to mimic the Korban Pesach that they set up, like their Weber barbecue in the backyard, right? Because there was no Beis Hamikdash to go to. And in fact, this whole issue about eating meat, right? It tells us that Todos of Rome, who was the leader of the Jewish community there. Now, in other words, he's not able to come on Aliyah Regel, right, to Yerushalayim, instituted the custom for the Roman Jews to eat kids roasted, mikulas whole, with their entrails over their heads on the evenings of Passover, as was the custom in the Beit HaMikdash. The sages sent a message to him and said, if you weren't Todos, an important person, we would have decreed that you be ostracized, right? That you put in Chayrim, because you, as if you're feeding Israel consecrated food, which may only be eaten in and around the Beis HaMikdash itself. And therefore, they were very opposed to this. And it also says that it happened that Rabban Gamliel once said to his slave, go and roast the Pesach sacrifice for us on a gridiron. And the rabbis of the Gemara were very angry with him, because they said, if we have these people who are doing these things, people are going to mimic, that it's okay to set up like a pseudo Korban Pesach in your backyard. So eventually what happened was they said, we're going to take that question out and they're going to replace it with reclining. Now, why we're reclining? So that's also interesting, because during the time of the early or Greco-Roman period, it was very common for people to recline. But by the time that the Haggadah became more put in formation, people were not reclining. The Roman symposia that some point to compare our Seder to, what, their famous paintings, they show, the philosophers reclining. The idea of a symposium to be akin to a Seder, I really say lahavdil, because a Roman symposia was only open to men. It wasn't there for women, and it certainly was not open for children. And children, and even our inner child, is such a component here. And while it was sort of an evening of wine and philosophical questions, and in fact, a custom of dipping. That, by the way, was that was very common in the Greco-Roman era, of taking vegetables and dipping it into vinegar. So the idea, by the way, that is how one of our questions actually also got changed, because in the Mishnah, it says in all other nights, we dip once, but tonight we dip twice. The question that we have in Manishtana, what does it say? It says in all other nights, we don't even dip once, but tonight we dip twice. And that was because at one point, dipping as a form of like an hors d'oeuvre went out of fashion. I had said in my Tuesday morning shiur, kind of brought up a memory of something from my childhood that I said, sometimes there's something that's so prevalent that everybody's doing, and then it goes completely out of fashion as a culinary style. So I said, how many people remember starting a meal with a cut grapefruit with like a maraschino cherry on it with, as a kid, all you wanted was the sweetness, and and your parents or even ourselves maybe had like a grapefruit spoon that had like ridges. And today, how many, we can all be eating grapefruits. That's, it's a healthy thing. Grapefruits aren't good for vitamin C, but how many of us have grapefruit spoons and we start meals? So I said, kind of lahavdil, that's the idea here, that the idea of dipping became very popular. In fact, today, articles and academic articles have been written about why all of a sudden are dips so popular in Jewish circles, right? A lot of us start our Shabbat meals with all kinds of dips, right? We have baba ganoush, we have hummus, we have tahina, jalapeno dip, olive dip. The list in all of these stores are getting, it's getting more and more popular. So again, here we see how the Haggadah was devised. It was things that people would be used to, or things that they were no longer used to, that then would pique the curiosity of a child. One other historic note that's very interesting is that in our Haggadah, if we jump more towards the end, how do we end after we have had all of our delicious food and we've had all of our delicious desserts and we've worked so hard on it? What is the last thing that we actually eat at the Seder, right? We will continue to drink our wine or our grape juice. The last thing we eat, of course, is the afikomen, is the part of the matzah that was put aside, that is the dessert. Now, one of the interesting also things that we find in rabbinic sources is it specifically says we don't end our meal, it says, with afikomen. But what do we end our meal with? Afikomen. So what are they? So there's two ways of understanding that. One way of saying what they're talking about is you don't, once you've had what we identify as the afikomen, you're not supposed to have a dessert afterwards. Like if you're thirsty after the Seder is over, you can have some water, some seltzer. Some say you can even have a cup of tea, but you can't raid the refrigerator once we've had the matzah, because the last taste, whether you're wealthy, you're poor, should be also, everybody has to say the same thing. But there's a linguistic thing explanation that's really very interesting. What potentially were the rabbis worried about? They saw what would happen at the end of these symposium. What would be the end? Like after all these philosophical questions were asked and answered, all the meal, all the drinking, they said that they would end with dessert. In Greek, the word dessert, I always feel like it's that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where the father was always connecting everything originally to Greek. The word epikomian is very similar to the word afikomen. Epikomian means entertainment. And what the rabbis were concerned about is that those symposiums ended as a bacchanal, as a very inappropriate, licentious event, and they didn't, and they kind of would go from house to house, and they said that's not what we end with. And then they did something brilliant. They took the very idea of a epikomian entertainment, and they said, no, the last thing that we are going to end with is that matzah that we have set aside. And again, also, what's so interesting is that matzah it has a dual meaning. It's both the bread of affliction and it's the bread of liberation. So they wanted to make everything even, and they wanted to make sure that our evening of celebration, sort of our symposium, we might say, on steroids, is nothing like what's going on culturally. This is a religious and it's a spiritual event, and it always has to be infused with that. So that's just, I think I find a very interesting linguistic example of something, of how something we might be led to think one way and it goes in a completely different direction. Of course, right from the get-go, one of the interesting things about the Seder is that we have 4 cups of wine. And if you notice, normally, what do we do on a Friday, on a Shabbat or on a Friday night or a holiday? We can really designate the person who is, let's say, the host of the meal or the head of the household to say, you make Kiddush and we'll be Yotze with you, etc. But on Pesach, on the Seder nights, we are all required to drink, essentially really to make our own Kiddush. And we all say Borei Pri Hagafen for each step of the Seder. And the rabbis debated this, would that be considered like a bracha levatala, like added bracha that you shouldn't make? And they give a host of reasons for it. It was interesting a number of weeks ago when we did the Tu B'Shvat Seder. If any of you joined us for that Tu B'Shvat Seder, we only made one bracha on the wine. We had 4 cups of wine, but unlike a Pesach Seder, we didn't make 4 brachot. Here at our Sedarim, we will be making 4 brachot. And the question is, why actually do we have 4 cups of wine? Why did the rabbis institute those 4 cups? So the most common answer that is given is that we learn that it corresponds to the 4 phases of redemption, right? That we find in the book of Shemot in Exodus, right? Where it says, God says, I will take you out from the pressure of work in Egypt, right? I will save you from their service. I shall redeem you. I shall take you as a people for me. And therefore we have 4 cups. But one of the arguments is that there was a 5th quote from the Torah, which is Vehaveti, and I will bring you to the land. So the question that was asked, by this point, the Jews already were exiled. The Jews that were remaining in Eretz Yisrael were living under Roman occupation. The question was, it said, and I will bring you to the land. We're in the land, but we're not politically free. We're not living in an age of Geula. The Beis Hamikdash has been destroyed. So should we have that 5th question? And therefore, they weren't sure, since we couldn't now bring the Karban Pesach, right? They said that's one of those questions that Eliyahu Hanavi has to answer, right? Eliyahu Hanavi is the harbinger of the Messianic era. So they said, therefore, what we're going to do is we'll have Kos Eliyahu. That will sort of, resolve that issue. Their Rabbi Menachem Kasher of blessed memory, who was a rabbi down in the Lower East Side, and very, very erudite, and who actually wrote the treatise on Manhattan as a natural Eruv. That was something that Manhattan, based on his tshuva, we didn't need a physical Eruv, and Manhattan really only got, I think, a physical Eruv, if I'm correct about it, at some point in maybe the late 1980s or early 90s, I think, when at some point they realized that the construction of Battery Park City interrupted Manhattan as a contiguous island. So we then ended up with like a Eruv both on the west side and the east side. But he wrote a Haggadah, and in the Kasher Haggadah, he says that now with the state of Israel, he said we should actually drink a 5th cup, because we can say Vehaveti, I'll bring you into the land. We've been brought into the land. So it's a very interesting thing in his Haggadah. You can find sort of how he does that. One of the Hasidic customs that is beautiful that I found in writing. I hope you'll forgive me. I have to give a plug. Is that okay? Is everyone all right with that? But the Jewish Journey Haggadah, it's available on Amazon. Although today I was told it's sold out. So till it gets restocked, I have copies. You can email me directly, Adena Berkowitz @gmail.com. That's Adena with an E. So forgive the plug, ADENA, the plug. But what a Hasidic custom says is that when it comes time to fill Kos Eliyahu, how should we fill it? They say we should take the cup and we should give the cup to everybody at the Seder, and they should take wine from their own cup and pour it in. And what is the reason for that? Because it's the idea that in order to bring the Geula, in order to bring the Messianic era, we have to do, as they say in French, our hishtadlus. We have to do what we can to bring that redemption. We have to help bring the redemption. We can't just be sitting and waiting for it to happen. That's a beautiful idea. There's also a custom some people do, that they save Kos Eliyahu for the next day for Kiddush. Now, I always say, I hope there's nothing left because it means that Eliyahu came to our Seder and drank of it. And just a personal story, at some point, somehow we got there was a man who, like, by day was an engineer and by night he was a inventor of different things. And he invented what he called the disappearing wine for Eliyahu's cup, which was really something adorable, that you poured the wine in it. And then when you got up to welcome Eliyahu in, there was this piece at the bottom you pressed and all the wine would go into the bottom. So for a very long time, our youngest kids really, really had incredible belief that Eliyahu Navi had come. Look, the wine is until one day our youngest had to be told the truth that we hope Eliyahu comes, but it's not based on necessarily if the wine is three quarters gone. One of the newer customs that happens at our Seder that I'd love, it's something we do that I'd like to share with you. Some of you might already do it, but I want to give you a little bit of sourcing for it because some people might be a little squeamish about it. Should we really be adding more rituals to our Seder table, to our Seder plate? And that is the concept of a kos Miriam, of having a nice glass, a goblet of water that is filled and put on the Seder table in memory of Miriam. And in preparing for my Haggadah and doing research, I found an incredible source for this, very close to the same idea, in which in the 10th century, people who lived in North Africa in a community called Ka'ir Ovan asked the Gaon of Pumbedita, the head of the Pumbedita yeshiva in Bavel, Rav Sharira, they said to him, why do we have what is the meaning of the two foods that are placed on the Seder table and on the plate? And specifically, they were talking about the shank bone and the egg. So the common explanation for that is that the egg represents the korban chagiga and is also reminiscent for us of the eggs, which is connected to what mourners eat, that it's a symbol of like the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And of course, the shank bone, which we don't eat, is a visual for the korban pesach. So that's a normal explanation. But what he said was that they symbolized the two messengers, Moshe and Aaron, whom God sent to Egypt. And he said, he told the people asking him this question, there are those who place a third food, fish, on the Seder table in memory of Miriam, as it says in Micha, and I will send before you Moshe and Aaron and Miriam. And he said that our tradition also teaches us that these three food items, egg, meat, and fish, will be eaten in the world to come. So this is incredible because this is not like a modern construct of something that you want to sort of have representation of women at the, in honor of just Miriam, that was something that was devised during the 20th century, 21st century, but it really has its roots going back much further of figuring out a way to honor Miriam, because let's face it, without her, there would be no Pesach story, because she was the one that encouraged her parents to remarry, and of course, her mother Yocheved gave birth to Moshe Rabbeinu. Another reason, by the way, that is given for why we drink 4 cups, there are different ones. One explanation is because it represents the 4 ways that the Jews in Egypt did not assimilate. For example, they didn't change their names, they didn't change their clothes, etc. But it's the Maharal who says that the reason why we actually have 4 cups of wine, he says, is in honor of our imahot. And I think this is beautiful because some of the things I've tried to do in the Haggadah is point out some ways that subtly we hear and we see sort of the role of women, both as tradition tells us that because of the righteous women, we were liberated from Egypt, but other ways that we see, whether it's Kos Miriam or this reference of the Maharal to the Imahot. Another interesting, and here's a suggestion that I saw based on a article a number of years ago that profiled a family, really at that point, the great grandparents of what they did at their Seder in Jerusalem. We have just some competition from my musical clock, so I apologize. It's just going to ring for a minute. But what what they did was, it was based on the background of this family. It's something to think about. The great grandparents, the mother and the father, had met in Europe, and they had said this would be a marriage that would never work because the husband came from like a very kind of yeshivish background, and the wife came from a more kind of, you might say more of like a modern Orthodox, German Yeki kind of background. And just how could the two mesh? Anyway, they got married, they had a child, and then the husband, who was studying at the Mir Yeshiva, was able, his wife did not have the right passport, couldn't go with him when the Mir Yeshiva escaped to Shanghai, and then eventually to Kobe, Japan, and they were separated. She ended up in Siberia, was lucky that she did with their child. He ended up in with the Mir Yeshiva, and eventually through serendipitous, they didn't even know if they had both survived. They ended up being reunited in America in the late, after the war, around 1947, 48. It was a miracle. And at their Seder in Jerusalem, these are very frum people. What they did was they would pass around, when they would get to the segment of the Chol Dor Vador, in every generation, a person has to see themselves as though they left Egypt. They were inspired by what Maimonides teaches us, which is the word lirot et atzmo, that we have to see ourselves, rather to read it differently and to have it as l'harot, to demonstrate. In some way, we have to demonstrate as though we left Egypt. So, for example, among Sephardim, it's very common. They take scallions. Yemenite Jews do this, and they'll hit themselves or their seatmate, right, to remind them of the striking of our forefathers and foremothers in Egypt by the taskmaster. Or they'll pick up a napkin and put a piece of matzah in it, and they'll get up and they'll say, where am I coming from? I'm coming from Egypt. Where am I going? I'm going to Eretz Yisrael. So it's a very good way to inspire children. But what this family does is that at their Seder, the great grandparents would pass around all of the visas, the transit visas, the passports, all of the things of what it took for them to get out of Europe and to work their way through all the countries that they passed through, then eventually in the United States, and then how they ended up in Israel. And for this article that was written in the Jerusalem Post, imagine the impact on even their own children, on their grandchildren, their great grandchildren. Everybody's now living in Israel, living in the modern state of Israel, of really seeing what does it mean to leave Mitzrayim, to leave near genocide. That's actually what Jews were experiencing in Mitzrayim. Here is a modern genocide of Hitler, Yamach Shemo V'Zichro, wanted to wipe us out, and they could say, we are here. We survived to tell the tale. So that's something to think about. Normally, I would say to give out passports, it would be considered muksa, but it has they felt that the fact that great grandfather had been a very well-known Orthodox rabbi, they felt it had an incredible pedagogic and had a need at the Seder. And that's something that for us, we can think about, are there things that we can do? One of the ideas I came up with was based on experience of my parents of blessed memory, who told me that they remembered, my mother told me she remembered, my mother, blessed memory, told me she remembered going in the mid 1960s to a dinner at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Now, this was kind of the Mad Men era when, people kind of got dressed up very swanky, with like a long gown and women and a mink stole. Yeah, I think you can picture it all. And she said, my dad came in with a tuxedo. Everybody was dressed to the nines, most beautiful, the place settings and the flowers. You can imagine just how beautiful this was. And it was a dinner for the World Confederation of Survivors of Bergen-Belsen. Okay, people had survived through having been most likely in prior death camps, but ended up in Bergen-Belsen. She said she walked in, she got a shock of her life. What was the centerpiece like that they had normally would be like, if you walk into the grand ballroom, it would be like a beautiful array of flowers and floral arrangements. She said it was a table that was filled with potatoes and potato peels, because it was those potato peels from those potatoes that saved many of the people there, that without that, they would have died. And that was a visceral reminder of what their enslavement was like. So I had suggested that if, again, we use a lot of potatoes at the Seder, of something like that to put on our Seder table to provoke conversation, because it doesn't look very pretty, no matter whether we're using real Pesach plate, our Pesach set, or disposables, it doesn't matter, but a plate of potato peels is not very nice to look at, but it provokes a conversation. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I bumped into an acquaintance of mine who told me she had followed my suggestion, and someone at the table kind of got annoyed and said, "Oh, that's like the most ugly thing. What is that? That's so ugly." And when she explained what it is, the person who had said that burst out crying, because that person's parents were survivors. So it concretized for her. In other words, these are not abstract things of just, when we talk about the Jews are enslaved and liberated, but there's so many examples of our own, attempts to kill us, that we have to make it very real for people around the table. Unfortunately, the one thing that has not gone out of style, we know, is anti-Semitism. But a Seder is an opportunity both to show, sort of, as our rabbis teach us, sort of, both the tragedy, but also the triumph. So that one of the things I've done at the Haggadah, I have lots of parody songs. So I try to balance out of some of the sort of the heavier things and of all the things we've gone through, but to try to make it as lively as possible. I know our time is running out, so I'm going to stop here. I see Rabbi Buchler. Thank you for joining us. So is everybody, I'm going to unmute. Rabbi Buchler, if you want to unmute everybody, just in case anybody has any questions or wants to add in anything unusual that you do at your Seder. That everybody would be interested to hear.
And I also just want to thank you, Dr. Adena Berkowitz, for, as always, sharing, your Torah, your experiences, and check out her Haggadah as well. And everyone is now unmuted, so if you have any questions, feel free to pose them to Dr. Berkowitz.
Okay, well, if we don't have any questions, then I hope you save all your questions for Seder night, whether you are with some family, you're with friends. But if you're soloing, then the rabbis actually ask that question: what happens if there are no children at the table? Who says the Manishtana? So they say, look, I don't want people to get into a fight, reveal ages, who's the youngest, etc. But even they say, if you're soloing, say the Manishtana out loud. And it's really, I really hope and pray that as the vaccine has become more available for everybody, this will be the last year. In other words, next year we'll be in Yerushalayim HaBnuyah with a rebuilt base Hamikdash. But at the very least, I pray that next year everybody should be well and we can be back to having big Seders. I know that the Jewish Center is having a COVID-safe public Seder, which is a great thing to have, so that people who, perhaps if you're soloing, at least you have an opportunity to be with others, which I think is a beautiful idea. But remember that one of the last thought that I'll share with you is that one of the most beautiful things about the part of the Seder where we have the four children are asking four different questions, and they represent four different prototypes of people. And what's beautiful about it is that it represents, I think, a key idea of our Masorah, that it talks about the wise child, but it talks about the contrarian child, right? The Russia. It talks about somebody who really is so simple, and someone who doesn't even know how to ask a question. And it's a reminder that when we come together, not only at Pesach time, but I think the whole year, we really have to reach out to as many people as we can, even some of those difficult people. I know lots of people who often have trauma associated with, and it's real, with, for example, Thanksgiving, of dreading it. And some people have dreaded Pesach Sederim, where you have difficult people there. But in a sense, now that we've seen what it's like to be soloing and what we've seen to have limited, I pray for the day when at least we can complain, right, about some of the people at our Seder. But hopefully we don't have to have a unanimity of views, but we have to be at least united in our love for each other and for our people and for our Masorah. And we can all say Lashana Haba Yerushalayim HaBnuyah. And Bezrat Hashem, I look forward to seeing everybody next year in rebuilt Jerusalem in our Beis Hamikdash. Until then, Chag Kosher v'Sameach.
Amen. Thank you,
Thank you.
Adena.
Amen.
Thank you.